Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. I'm delighted to extend a warm welcome to Professor Jeffrey Schwartz as he joins us on our podcast. Professor Jeffrey is an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia Business School, where he co-designed the Future of Work MBA and Executive Education courses. He is also the Vice President of Insights and Impact at Gloat, the world's leader in talent marketplaces and skills analytics powered by AI. Previously, he spent 20 years at Deloitte Consulting, serving as US leader for the future of work and senior partner in global human capital. He has held leadership roles in marketing, talent practices, and global delivery in India. He was the founding editor of Deloitte's Global Human Capital Trends Report and co-founded Catalyst Tel Aviv, Deloitte's first global innovation hub, where he met Gloat's founders. An acclaimed expert in work and workforce transformation, Professor Jeffrey has led consulting practices across the US, India, Israel, Belgium, Russia, and Kenya. Professor Jeffrey completed joint graduate studies at the Yale School of Management and Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. He holds a BA in History and Government from Cornell University, where he also served as a member of the Board of Trustees from 1979 to 1980. In 2024, Thinkers 360 recognized Professor Jeffrey as one of the top 50 global leaders and influencers in the future of work. In this episode, Professor Jeffrey Scott shares profound insights from his highly acclaimed book, Workforce Ecosystems, Reaching Strategic Goals with People, Partners, and Technologies. Professor Jeffrey, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you today as well.
Thank you. Professor, can you start by explaining what a workforce ecosystem is and how it differs from traditional workforce models?
Absolutely. So let me start by just giving a little bit of background to the research that led to the writing of this book. I was a senior partner in Deloitte Consulting and Human Capital for 20 years. We did a series of research when I was a partner at Deloitte from, I think, 2018, 19 to 2021. And we did a series of research on the future of the workforce. Deloitte had a longstanding relationship with MIT Sloan Management Review. We've worked with them for probably 10 or 12 years. We did a series of research on the evolution of the digital organization. And as I mentioned, in 2018, we pivoted our research, 2019, to focus on the future of the workforce. And this was very much a collaborative effort that included some partners from Deloitte, myself, and Robin Jones, who at the time was the head of the workforce transformation practice. We worked with a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, a professor named Elizabeth Altman. Elizabeth Altman is actually a specialist in ecosystems, and we brought her ecosystemic perspective into the work that we were doing on workforces. And we also worked with David Kieran, who's the head of the Big Ideas program at Sloan Management Review. So we had MIT involved, we had universities involved, and we had Deloitte involved. And we started in 2018, 2019, looking at how the workforce was changing. We did a series of very large quantitative surveys, and we did hundreds of interviews. And in the first year of the research, we focused on what we called at that point in 2019, opportunity marketplaces and talent marketplaces. And we were very interested in internal mobility and dynamic talent models in organizations. And in 2020, we really pivoted to reframing our research. So when you ask the question, what is a workforce ecosystem? When Liz Altman and I did many of the interviews together, we started, Deepak, with this question. When I say workforce, what do you think about? Who do you think about? What does workforce mean to you? And again, in more than 100 interviews, this was actually a very interesting question, because almost to a person, people said something like, that's an interesting question. We've been thinking about who is the workforce. We've been thinking about what is the workforce, right? And so workforce ecosystems is a sort of highly integrated and holistic view of who and what constitutes the workforce. Excuse me. Of course, the traditional workforce, when I say workforce, people say, oh, you mean my employees. And what we found is that I think it was like 87% of the people that we surveyed said when we say workforce, we mean something more than employees. We mean employees. We mean contractors. We mean marketplaces. We mean gig workers. We mean marketplaces. We mean complementators, which I can talk about as well. And then, of course, over time, we added technology to it, right? And the reason we added technology to it is literally as we're doing these interviews and surveys and we're asking who is your workforce, we actually had an interview early on with NASA, the Space Administration here in the US, who said, well, when we talk about our workforce, we talk not only about the people and our contractors, internal talent and external talent, we're also talking about technology as part of the workforce. Now, again, this is interesting, Deepak, and hopefully to our listeners, because this is 2019, 2020. And of course, we're talking about technology and machines as talent, right? And here we are in 2020, 2025. And one of the biggest trends, I think we hopefully can agree, in the future of the workforce today and work is the role of agentic AI, which is exactly having some of the work we're doing being done by technology as colleagues. So when we say workforce ecosystem, we're looking at the most broad, inclusive view of who does work and contributes value to your organization.
Sir, how has the rise of technology and the gig economy reshaped the traditional concept of a workforce?
So I think technology is a major force here. When we thought about, as we did over the course of a couple of years, sort of what are the drivers of workforce change, moving us from an employee-centric view to an ecosystemic view, we'd sort of summarize it with four big challenges. One, the nature of work itself is changing. And in particular, we are seeing more and more project-based work, right? Work is being projectized, if I can use that phrase. There was a very interesting study, there's a lot of interesting studies, but a particularly relevant study from McKinsey, the consulting firm in 2024, talking about org and technology transformation. And it reinforces this point of how the nature of work is changing. The McKinsey observation is if you look back 10 or 20 years, 80% of the work that we do is process-based, broken down into standard tasks and standard jobs. And 20% of the work that we did 10, 20 years ago was special projects. The way they see the world evolving, and I think we see it evolving very much in this way, we may get to a point in the next few years where 20% of the work looks like process and standardized tasks, and 80% of the work looks like projects. And in a projectized world, more of the work fits into an ecosystemic model where both you can access talent from within and across the organization, but also you can more broadly access talent that's outside the organization as well. So that's number one, the nature of work is changing. The second is workers' preferences are shifting, right? And we can talk about the different generations of the workforce. We can talk about what we've seen, especially in the last 4 or 5 years around distributed work, hybrid work, and remote work. We're also seeing that the reason that workers' preferences are changing is the nature of our lives and our work lives are changing. Let me give the specific example that I would think about and I would add to this based on the work that I've done with Liz and David and Robin, is that we are in this longevity dividend. We are living longer lives. If you're hiring somebody in 2025 who's in their early 20s, they can expect to be around to the year 2100 or the year 2105, right? They may live, God willing, to be 100 years old. They may have a 50 or 60 year career, right? So when we have portfolio careers, being able to access people in different ways during those careers becomes important. Of course, just to respond directly to your question, technology is playing a role in this as well. And the gig economy or the temp economy is playing a role. The temp economy has really been around since the end of World War II, right, which is the beginning of manpower. So the temp economy itself isn't new. Employee perspectives, as I've mentioned, have changed. But technology does make it easier, right? Technology lowers the transaction costs. It makes it easier for us to both find and assess and contract with and manage the legal compliance required for workers. So it is much easier today because of technology to do that. And the last thing I'll mention is, look, the nature of work has changed. Workers' preferences are changing. Technology is changing the way that we can access and manage talent. Workers see themselves differently today, in some sense, than they did several years ago. Many workers today consider themselves free agents versus loyal employees. Even people inside companies think of themselves more as free agents than they do as loyal employees. So I think all of these factors are sort of driving us towards this more ecosystemic view than you have one job or one career in one company.
What are some of the unique challenges organizations face when managing workforce ecosystems, especially with a mix of internal and external collaborators?
Yeah. So we've been talking for a few minutes. Let me provide the definition of a workforce ecosystem that we worked on for quite some time. And I think that will help us frame this question of some of the challenges. So the way we define a workforce ecosystem, it's a structure, an organizational structure that's focused on value creation for the organization and encompasses a variety of actors, both actors within and beyond the organization itself. That everybody is working to pursue both individual and collective goals, and that this system includes interdependence and complementarities among all the participants, right? So it's a little complicated. So let's sort of break it down into the pieces. It's a structure, an entity that is trying to create value. It is recognizing that to do that, the way that we access and deploy and orchestrate internal and external actors, recognizing that there are things that are highly interdependent, there are things that are highly related to do that become important. I think one way to focus on this question of challenges is to simply think about the words that we use to describe how do we manage an employee system and how do we orchestrate a workforce ecosystem, right? And when we talk about employee management, we have a whole history for 100 years, 125 years on HR employee management, which is based on a very specific employee life cycle. Attract, develop, retain, right? We hire people, we train people, we keep people, or we fire people, right? It's a very linear way of thinking about it. And careers and jobs were extremely linear, which is, we can go back to Frederick Taylor in the early 1900s and scientific management. And it was literally about mechanizing work and mechanizing careers. The challenge we have when we move from the employee life cycle to the workforce ecosystem is that, I think the starting point is, and I think this is why we were sort of very excited. Our book won a prize from Axiom Book Medals as a gold medalist for business theory. The shift here in business theory is really about how do you shift from an employee management mindset to a workforce ecosystem mindset, right? That's probably the biggest challenge. If we look organizationally at who is involved today in orchestrating workforce ecosystems, of course, employees are managed generally by HR, to some degree with finance. Contractors are largely managed through procurement and the supply chain team. And technology, including technology as a workforce participant, is generally managed by IT, the CIO and the IT organization. So a piece of it is over here, and a piece of it is over there, and a piece of it is over there. So I think one challenge, again, to start is, do we have an integrated view of the ecosystem? And how do we align the variety of organizational actors, the senior business executives, the people leading the actual business teams, the HR team, the procurement team, the I team, and the finance team, and the legal team, so that they have this integrated view of how we're orchestrating workforce ecosystem. So one of the things that we do in the book, and we did in our research, is we created a model that looked at the leadership axis, which is the role senior leaders play and business managers play. I call it the shoulders of the model, which is HR and procurement, and the knees of the model, which is how does IT and legal and finance, how do they work together on this? So I think that's part of one of the challenges. I think the other challenge that we can go into is when you move from an employee model to an ecosystem model, you are changing management practices. You are changing the way that you use and think about technology. You are changing how you do what we call integration architectures, which is the governance is different, and the leadership practices are also different. So these are sort of the layers of challenge that you have when you're moving from an employee-centric system to an ecosystemic way of thinking about the workforce.
Professor Jeffrey, could you share a notable case study or example from the book that illustrates the successful implementation of a workforce ecosystem?
Yeah, so I will give you one. I think one of the things that we're most proud of in the book is that we have quite a few examples. But I will give one example because I think it helps to illustrate sort of how workforce ecosystems and how that thinking is playing out. We have one of the companies that we refer to throughout the book is Novartis, the pharmaceutical company. And we did a series of interviews with Marcus Graf, who is the head of talent management at Novartis. And, fundamentally, what they are saying at Novartis is that anybody who contributes to our business value is part of our workforce ecosystem. And I think for those of us that are familiar with the structure of the pharmaceutical industry, of course, you have employees. I think they have about, at the time that we did the research, they've since done some divestiture. They had about 100,000 employees and about 50,000, let's call them external workers. And of course, when I think many of us are familiar with, again, the pharma industry, you have the people that are doing research at medical schools and medical labs and biotechnology startups. You have the people doing clinical trials, for example. So I think it's fairly easy, and it's a good example of what that ecosystem value chain looks like. What's interesting about Novartis is they were very deliberate in trying to understand what their workforce ecosystem was. So as I said, with the way Marcus described it, is our workforce ecosystem, our workforce is anyone who contributes to executing work towards our purpose and our business strategy, right? So when they looked at the HR side and the procurement side, the IT and the finance side, it's a highly orchestrated piece. What that meant was, in order to do some version of workforce ecosystem orchestration, they needed to integrate and connect talent acquisition and talent management very tightly, right? They needed to think about what data do they need and how do they access that data in integrated systems so that they could look in one place and in a common set of dashboards at employee data and contractor data, internal data and external data. And then they also focused on how do they do this in real time so that people that are managing and building projects, which becomes a big part of the work that we're doing, as we said, can access talent inside and outside, manage it, deploy and redeploy it to actually get work done. So I think it goes back to sort of two of, I think, our biggest observations in workforce ecosystems, which is when we think about it, even for a couple of minutes, we recognize that the workforce is a much broader continuum than employees. Again, as it goes to employees, freelancers, contractors, complementators, marketplaces, technology, and customers themselves. But also that managing workforce ecosystems, and I think this is part of what we see in the Novartis case that we explored in the book, involves connecting the various systems and connecting the various players on the leadership team so that they have this common view of the workforce that is not employees over here, contractors over here, and technology over there. It's this connected view.
Both leadership qualities and management practices are crucial for navigating and leading workforce ecosystems.
Yes, so this is one of the key questions that we looked at. And we looked at both management practices and leadership practices because they're obviously different. And one of the things we did in the research, and it's summarized in the book, is we look at the core management practices that we have historically been using to manage an employee-centric attract, develop, retain model, the employee life cycle, and how that shifts and evolves when we look at an ecosystem. So I'll summarize it this way. If in the world of an employee life cycle, the management practices are based on hire, train, and retain, in a workforce ecosystem model, we move from hiring and attraction to access, right? How do we access talent? How do we access talent anywhere in the organization? And that's where talent marketplaces have become a big part of this discussion in workforce ecosystems. But how do we access internal and external talent? How do we access talent recognizing that work is being pixelated, right? One way to think about this, Deepak, is we're seeing work being pulled in two different directions. Work is being broken down and fragmented into smaller tasks. So we need to be able to manage that fragmentation, that task focus. Work is also being broadened into projects, right? So how do we access talent and technology in different ways? It's obviously some of it is about training, but it's also really about how do we grow the talent that we have? How do we grow talent inside and outside of our organization, right? Now, I just have to give a very brief example when I say how do we grow talent outside our organization. There are a couple of examples that we've seen that I think help us think this through and visualize it in a very straightforward manner. There's a company called Applause. It's a global software testing company. They have several hundred employees, but they also have hundreds of thousands of software testers. And one of the things that they do is they provide training, very easily accessible training, to help people become part of their software testing network and to be certified and to come into that network. They are training people, they are growing people who are not employees of their organization. Right. And we're seeing other examples of this. Another example of this is people that take training courses, technology training courses. And then some of those courses are free and some of those courses have small fees. But imagine you have a training course that you put out to everybody in the world. And what you're really doing is trying to find the top 10% of people that complete that course and then offering them jobs. Right. So we are training, we are growing the workforce, but not only our own employees, we're growing people outside. And then how do we engage with the workforce as managers? And engage is an interesting view. It's a very deliberate word because it's not just about employee experience for the people that work with us, but what's the broader experience? What's the experience you have as a contractor working with us? What's the experience you have as a supplier organization working with us. So what's the workforce ecosystem experience, which is much broader? We also have this concept that many of us have heard about in the last few years of what does it mean to be an alumni of an organization? You may be a former employee who becomes a contractor. How do we continue to manage that relationship with you so that we can engage with you so that your preference is to work as an ecosystemic worker with our company versus someone else? So all the management practices in this sense, I think, are shifting. Again, in terms of leadership, it's largely about the strategic mindset, right? How are we thinking about all of the different ways that we can bring talent and talent type resources into the organization? I think the last piece that I'll mention in terms of leadership, and we can go into it further if you like, is we tend to think, and we've thought for many years, that you tell me the strategy and then I'll give you the structure. Structure follows strategy. Workforce follows organization, and workforce follows and organization follows strategy. One of the things that we're seeing, which is very interesting from a leadership perspective, is the dynamic interplay between what a workforce ecosystem is and how it can actually help create new strategies. I've mentioned already this company Applause, which is a global software testing company. We're all extremely familiar with the ride-sharing companies, right? In India, I think it's Ola. I can't remember who it is. In the US and other countries around the world, it's Uber. There are different versions of this. But these are examples of companies and strategies that are possible because of a workforce ecosystem model, right? And so I think one of the leadership challenges is to ask the question, what business strategies are possible if we view our talent world through this workforce ecosystemic lens?
So, Professor, what ethical, societal, and public policy considerations should leaders be aware of when managing these complex workforce ecosystems?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. The way we organized our the book, about a third of the book focuses on workforce ecosystem strategies and definitions. About a third of it focuses on the management and leadership and technology practices. And the last section of the book talks about social and political issues and then sort of the pathway forward. It's very interesting because the way that most public policy is set up today in much of the world, it is based on the mindset, the model, that the workforce is basically composed of employees, right? And that everything else is in an other category, right? right? And, when we look at, again, as I mentioned, 87% of the people we surveyed in 3 global surveys said that, of course, our workforce is much broader than employees. Almost every large organization and company in the world is orchestrating a workforce ecosystem. And yet our public policy in most countries in the world assumes that employment, full-time employment or significant part-time employment is the model for the way that we recognize who's an employee, we analyze skills, and we also provide different types of benefits, social benefits, including healthcare benefits. Certainly in the United States, this is an issue, and pension benefits as well. So we are in the middle of a reframing period. I think some of the biggest challenges for us on the social policy side and the labor policy side is shifting our view from a narrow view of what it means to be an employee to a much broader, this ecosystemic view. Portable benefits, how we're supporting lifelong learning. There are some very interesting innovations going on this now. Very interesting innovations going on around the world in this area. A really fascinating area to look at is Singapore, which is one of the first countries in the world that began to provide lifelong learning credits to citizens of the country. They did something, I think, last year was they have a special focus in reskilling programs for employees over 40. I guess over 40 means that you're an older person. We can have a separate discussion about what that means. But it's just interesting because the recognition that people are living longer and are working in different relationships to companies is not yet something that many public policy and educational institutions have caught up on. So there's some very interesting work being done by countries. Singapore is an example. There are a number of states in the US that I think have very innovative workforce development programs as well. And it'd be very interesting to take the ideas of workforce ecosystems. And we've talked about this at Columbia. I teach at the business school. We've been having discussions with the School of International and Public Affairs about teaching a version of the Future of Work class that I teach for people that are getting master's degrees in public policy and public administration. So I think we're just beginning that work. And I think what we see happening on benefits and definitions and taxation and education will be major parts of how that plays out.
Professor, how do emerging technologies like AI and robotics facilitate the development and management of workforce ecosystems? And
Yeah.
what role do they play in ensuring their success?
So it's interesting. I think sometimes I'm going to provide two perspectives on this, the role of technology. When we spoke at the beginning of our conversation about what are the driving forces, we talked about the changing nature of work, the changing expectations of the workforce, loyalty, and also technology. So technology is not the only driver, right? But it is a major driver here. The sort of the economist in me keeps coming back to this question of transaction cost economics and how transaction costs help us structure the firm. The lowering of transaction costs because of the technologies we have, the platforms we have that help us access talent, the role that AI plays. In this case, starting with predictive AI, even before we get to generative AI, these technologies do make it easier and more cost-effective to run workforce ecosystems. But I think one way to think about the technology question is to take a step back and think about the different roles that technology plays in a workforce ecosystem. And, we're good academics and management consultants. So we literally have a chapter on technology enablers and workforce ecosystems. And we identify sort of 5 roles that technology play. And some of them will be very familiar and some of them will be a little bit new. We talk about a category that we call work tech, right? And by work tech, we mean the technology that we use to actually do our work, right? So it could be something simple like Word or Excel or a spreadsheet program. It could be digital surgery tools that we're using if we're surgeons using digital surgery technology. It could be think of all the different programs that are on the desk of a trader in an investment bank or investment management. The technologies that we use to actually do our work, right? Then there is workplace technology. Now we're recording this through Zoom, so we're all working. We're using Atlassian programs. We're using Microsoft Teams and these types of technology. The different technologies that we use to actually be able to distribute work across place and time. There's another category, which is workforce tech itself, right? And workforce tech, again, it's not as simple as HR technology, sort of human capital management systems, but we have transaction and compliance systems for our employees. We have transaction and compliance systems for our contractors. And then we have marketplaces and development and growth platforms like Gloat, the one that I work with, the company out of Israel, that are actually using AI to create internal markets and development spaces for organizations as well. So workforce tech is really expanding to include internal and external workers, and transactional and growth experiences. But let me mention two other roles of technology. One is a role that it became very apparent to us as we were doing the research over several years, and we call it credentialization and verification tech. Okay. And this is a very easy way to think about this, I think. When I went to work at Deloitte, I guess in 2001, they asked me what my educational history was, and I told them I went to Cornell and I did graduate studies at Yale and Princeton. And then they said, send me a copy of the transcripts, official transcripts from the universities to put into your employee file, right? So I literally, I don't even remember if it was an email, or I wrote a letter to the registrars at the universities, and then they charge $20 and they give you an official version of your transcript, and it has a raised seal on it. And then you sent that document to the administrative offices of Deloitte, which I think were in Tennessee at the time, and they put it in your file and they verified that you have the degrees that you said that you had, right? That is not a very fast-moving, real-time way of keeping track of the certificates, the educational backgrounds, the experiences that people have. So we're seeing the emergence of a whole new tech layer that is helping us to, hopefully in more real time, verify, do Jeff and Deepak have the certificates and the degrees that they have, so that we can very quickly make an employment decision on them, versus having to do a long due diligence and that process. We're seeing both commercial entities like Credily, we're seeing not-for-profit blockchains like Velocity Networks. They're developing, but it's a whole new layer that really helps the workforce ecosystem move faster and with the kind of verification and trust that's required. So that's a pretty new area. The last area, which we've touched on already, and we've talked about workforce tech, workplace tech, work tech, verification tech, is technology as a workforce participant, right? And this goes back to agentic AI. This goes back to robots. And sort of part of what we're challenged to think about is, how do we redesign and re-engineer work? I think this is one of the major trends that we're going to see in 2025, 2026, and 27. How do we redesign teams and work where people and technology are working together, both as tools and assistants and colleagues and managers? So there are many roles that technology is playing, and how do we integrate and orchestrate what people do and what technology does is very much front and center right now.
Professor, in an era of shrinking attention spans, how can the HR department effectively manage and optimize the workforce ecosystem?
So, well, you've asked two questions, which is one, how do we manage in a time of shrinking attention spans? And then what is the role that HR plays in leading workforce ecosystems? So let me very briefly touch on both. A very interesting question, I think, for research today is, what impact technology, social media in particular, the fact that so much of the time that we spend, and younger people and people in different generations spend, is on screens, what impact that is having on the way that we actually grow and develop our minds, right? I'm in my mid-60s. I did not use a computer until I went to graduate school. For me, the book was the main technology, and I wrote the papers in my undergraduate degree in history and government on a typewriter. Actually, I wrote them out on a pad, and then we edited it. We did it in longhand, and then we wrote it on a typewriter. But the process of reading a book and the process of writing by hand to identify what the key themes were actually also has an impact on the way that we develop our mind. There's an impact on the wiring of our brain. So I think there's some very interesting questions about, if you are a digital native or an AI native, what impact that has on the wiring of your mind and how you learn. So let's maybe that's a podcast where you can talk to some neuroscientists who are looking at these questions. That these are very significant questions. I think the question of the role that HR plays is a really spot on question. I literally am just finishing a piece that I'm publishing this week on challenges for HR and business leaders in 2025. And the question that I'm asking, we're recording this at the end of January. I'm assuming the podcast will be out in late January, early February, is where do you think, this is an American expression, a Canadian expression, where do you think the puck is going to be in December 2025? Right? What is the future that we imagine at the end of this year? Right? And if you are an HR leader, I don't think there's any question that you need to be looking at the whole distributed hybrid work question. You need to be looking at the workforce ecosystem question. How do we take and involve internal employees, external employees, and then how do we integrate technology itself together? And there's going to be a massive amount, I believe, a massive amount of activity around work redesign and work reengineering. And this is something that I think HR can play a very significant role in, but it involves HR not selling what HR is doing, but HR working with integrated business and leadership teams on this work redesign, right? And one way of thinking about this is every senior executive is worried about how their industry is changing, right? They're thinking about how companies, how we're breaking down silos and boundaries across industries, right? So how can we move internal and external employees around in order to get the work done that we need to do? But how do I do this by pairing up or teaming up rather with the head of a business unit and an IT leader and a finance leader so that I can have a team of senior leaders working on a common set of programs and initiatives around the redesign of work, skilling for the future, and bringing together this ecosystemic view, right? It's not an HR function alone, right? Much of the work we're doing, we talked at the beginning of our conversation about how work is being projectized. Work is also becoming much more multidisciplinary, right? And so the question for the head of HR is, how do I lead in a multidisciplinary way? How do I develop multidisciplinary leaders across the organization and managers as well? So it's a very interesting time for HR leaders, but it's not about the HR piece. It's about the combination of HR and talent with work redesign, with new kind of thinking about productivity, with how we're bringing in technology to get to new levels of innovation. So, I think 2025 and 2026 are going to be a very interesting time, not just for HR, but for everybody on the business suite. And sort of I'll end sort of my observation here, which is many companies find themselves today with a transformation backlog, right? What I mean by that is there's so much work we need to do around skills. There's so much work we need to do around workforce ecosystems. There's so much work we need to do around work redesign. How can HR play, again, this orchestrational role in order to bring these initiatives together with business leaders and finance leaders directly?
Thank you, Professor Jeff Schwartz, for sharing your invaluable insights and expertise with us today. Your deep understanding of workforce ecosystem and the evolving nature of work has provided our listeners with a fresh perspective on how to navigate and lead in this complex, interconnected environment. To our audience, thank you for tuning in. We hope you found this conversation as enlightening and thought-provoking as we did. Be sure to check out Professor Jeff Scott's book, Workforce Ecosystem, Reaching Strategic Goals with People, Partners, and Technologies for a deeper dive into the crucial topic. Stay tuned for more engaging episodes, and until next time, keep exploring the future of work and leadership. Thank you once again, Professor Jeff Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepak. And thanks to your listeners.
Thank you.